All right, we're going to try to get started again so that we can go to lunch at some kind of reasonable time. Our next speaker is Dr. Julian Burger. You've heard his name already bantered about several times. For nearly 20 years, he was responsible for the United Nations Human Rights Program for Indigenous People. Excuse me. In that capacity, he organized the negotiations from inside the United Nations system that led to the adoption of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples by the General Assembly and helped to set in place the UN's principal meeting spaces and institutions for indigenous peoples. These include the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the Special Rapporteur, and the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. For 2 years, he was Deputy Director of the Humanitarian Commission, a high-level think tank set up by the UN, and prior to that was Director of the Anti-Slavery International, the world's oldest human rights body. He's written extensively on human rights and indigenous people and has taught as visiting professors at the universities of Spain, the UK, New Zealand, Switzerland, and here in the US. He holds a PhD from the University of Essex, where he specialized in the political economy of Latin America. And last but not least, he has taught with the University of Tulsa's Geneva Institute on Indigenous and Indian Law since we began that program in the early 2000s. So thank Dr. Julian Burger, and please help me welcome him.
Well, good morning, and let me start by, first of all, thanking all of you at Tulsa for inviting me, and it's very nice to get out of Geneva as the winter's beginning and come here to Tulsa, where it looks like summer is really going to last forever. It's fantastic to be in the sunshine, so that's great. I'm also would like to say that I don't have any high-tech kind of stuff that all these indigenous peoples are into. I'm going to be very old, oral tradition, and just talk. Oh, it's a joke, Tim, don't worry. First of all, I was sort of happy to listen to the two stories before because I'm a non-indigenous person, as you can probably guess. I'm what the Australians call a POM, which is an Englishman. It's pretty insulting when they call us POMs, but anyway, an Englishman. I'm from London. And the indigenous issue is an issue which I had no idea about until something happened in my country. And I'm going to tell a little bit my story, a little bit like Willie told his story, in a way. It's going to be a different perspective, but I hope, and we'll probably touch on some of the same things that were covered in both Wilted Littlechild and Tim Coulter. But I hope maybe you'll see it from a different perspective, and maybe could be interesting for you. If it's not interesting, you can sleep. If it is, you can cheer and do whatever you like to do. My story is kind of starting with somebody called Margaret Thatcher. I don't know if anybody's heard of Margaret Thatcher anyway, but probably some of the younger people never heard of her, but probably older amongst you know that she was a prime minister in my country at one point. And she was not a very liberal politician. She was a politician on the right. And when I was younger than I am today, because I'm still young, when I was younger, I was just beginning a career in a university of Essex, which is just near London. And I was in a Center for Latin American Studies. And I had a kind of one of those jobs that you have in universities where you don't get much money, you're just starting, you haven't got any firm contract, the kind of thing probably. And the head of the department said, our department's going to have some cuts. And I'm afraid you're the youngest and the newest, and it's all Thatcher. She's cutting back on all of us universities. And our department deal with Latin America. Latin America is very radical in their ears, we're just going to get any money. I more or less had my hours cut down so much I had to get a job. Now, at that time in England, there were jobs, actually, in those days. I mean, some of you probably don't remember, but there were jobs around, and even you could pick up a paper and more or less get a job. It wasn't like you had to have 500 different candidates and, I don't know, whatever you have to do these days. And I got a job, and it's true, I got a job as the Director of Research in an NGO, which I actually had never heard of. I just seen it in the newspaper, and it was called the Anti-Slavery International, which actually I learned was one of the oldest NGOs, human rights NGOs. I'll get to the point, don't worry. I'm not going to tell my whole life story. This NGO had been set up in the 1830s, actually, to combat, I mean, not to combat slavery. Slavery had been abolished, and this NGO was set up to implement the slavery legislation or whatever, the laws that UK had decided at that time. Of course, at that time they had extensive control over large parts of the world, so they were able to implement. Anyway, all that to say, I came on board in this NGO in 1982, and I was meant to start my job in September 1982, but they said to me, you know, would you mind awfully starting just a little bit before and just going for 1 week to Geneva. So I said, you're going to pay me? And they said, yeah. And I said, yes, I'd like to go to Geneva, to the UN. And I went there, and there were 2 working groups I was meant to cover. One was the working group on slavery, which existed some years, and it was a UN expert group that tried to discuss slavery. It was really not a very dynamic working group. But I was told there was a new one just starting out, and I should go to it. I should follow it and just write up a report on whatever. And I was meant to give a speech as well about a place I'd never heard of called the Chittagong Hill Tracts, which was in Bangladesh. I knew nothing about it, but they drafted something for me because one of the members of the board was very, very active on human rights in this particular part of Bangladesh, which is up in the mountains, called the Chittagong Hill Tracts. And my speech I was meant to give in this environment. And I went with actually with another colleague, another person who was a Philippines woman, Joji Carino, who some of you know at that time. And we were there, and we were meant to, if you like, be representing this NGO and so on. Now, 1982 was the first meeting of this working group on indigenous populations. In a way, it's my starting point, my discovery of indigenous people's issues, because before that, I didn't know anything about indigenous peoples. I'd lived in Latin America, I'd lived in Brazil, I'd lived in Chile, I visited most of the Andean countries. But I had never really thought about this issue, heard about it. It wasn't on my radar at all. And so when I got there, this meeting was like an extraordinary revelation. And it was a kind of discovery of a whole part of history I knew nothing about, because my history doesn't include the history of indigenous peoples. My history is something else. It's the kings and the queens and all those people. We have a kings and queens in my country, as you probably know. Well, a queen, anyway. And so this kind of stories that I was listening to, and why was it interesting? Because suddenly I realized that there was something out there I didn't know anything about, and I really had to start working on and learning and listening to people. And it was interesting for 2 reasons. First of all, because, well, perhaps for 3 different things I learned from that meeting. Number one, I did not or could not believe that there were people in the world who were being killed just because of their identity. And that was the case in 1982 when we were listening to information, in this case from Guatemala. Many of you remember that. This was a time when the regime in Guatemala officially was trying to eliminate the indigenous peoples. It was a governmental policy to eliminate indigenous peoples at that time under Rios Montt. It was an unbelievable thing to listen to in the 20th century, that there should be things going on that actually not many people knew about. I didn't know about it. It was not publicly available in the press. And yet here we were listening to stories, and the person who came was later to get the Nobel Prize, Rigoberta Menchú. And this story was a very, for me, extraordinary story, because there was not just the question of Guatemala, but it was also other countries. Philippines was mentioned. I mentioned Joji Carino, which was again under the dictatorship of Marcos, if you recall this man, who was invading the indigenous territories in the Cordillera, building a whole series of dams. Indigenous peoples were opposing them, indigenous peoples being assassinated. This was a project supported by the World Bank. It was something, again, which was unbelievable to learn. And again, for somebody who had not been in this kind of environment, seemed to hear that these things were going on, and nobody was really doing much about it, and nobody knew much about it. But there was a second thing which was quite interesting, and that was all of the stories which indigenous peoples were telling. And there were not many, I should say, because I think there were something less than 20 people in the room probably at that point. And they had a lot of time to talk, I have to say. They really didn't have 5 minutes, 3 minutes like some of you guys had when I was on the podium. But they had, time to really go in and talk about something. And I do remember a man, and it was, for me, what he said was something so incredible for me, and not for you, because but for me. There was a guy, I think he was a Lakota Indian, and he was trying to explain to us ignorant people in the room, including the so-called experts, because this was a meeting of experts on indigenous peoples. They were experts, weren't they? In those days, the experts were those academics and lawyers who were, in the subcommission, this human rights body, and so on. The things changed a little later when the indigenous people became the experts, but there we are. And this Lakota was explaining something, and it's always, I will not forget, he was a real poet, so I can't possibly try to repeat what he said, but he was trying to say, you have to understand the way we think about land. And he said, for us, let me put it this way, you have your spiritual beliefs, and when you have a spiritual belief, you build your church, or you build your temple, you build a mosque. And for you, this is the place where you can go, you can worship, you can, your spiritual base, you can have this space. And he said, wherever you go, you can build this, and you can make it your place where you can come, and you can be in touch with the spirit, and and so forth. So he said, I guess, even if you went to the moon, you could build your church, you could build your mosque, and that would be a spiritual base. But for us indigenous people, that's not possible. Our church, our cathedral is this land out there. This is the mountains and the rivers. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. I never thought about anything like that. I'm from London. How can I think that people can have a relationship with their land? I mean, how many times have I moved in my house in London? You get a cheaper place in the south, you go to the south. If you can get a bigger place which has not got water dripping through, you go somewhere else, etc. So these were kind of revelations. And I think there's something, because actually I really want to talk about achievements. But this was my first experience in 1982. And it was one that made me feel I ought to learn more about indigenous peoples, and I really, really benefited from all of the many, many hundreds of indigenous peoples who came to meetings and who shared their experiences not with me particularly, they weren't talking to me, but in meetings where I was present and where I was able to learn. At a certain point I had learned, and I was able almost to say what they could say in their speeches. After a while I got very smart. But anyway, the learning process was extremely important. One of the things that I think is maybe a good, how can I say, a comparison is that when indigenous peoples came in 1982, they came and they were kind of, if I could understand it, like on a voyage of discovery. If I can put it like that. Now you have in a few days, I think you have something called Columbus Day, right, here in the US. It's to celebrate Columbus, right? And all of you are going to be celebrating like mad, I'm sure, in this meeting. So you have this, and Columbus Day is a holiday. And you know, of course, he discovered the Americas, as we know, and I'm not going to go into that in detail. But when I thought about this, and I thought it's Columbus Day coming up, I thought, in a way, indigenous peoples did a kind of Columbus too. You know, they came to the UN on their discovery, I think. And that's a little bit coincided with my own personal discovery, because it was my first visit to the UN in 1982 and the early 80s. And although it's true that what Willie and Tim have referred to as earlier experiences, such as the meetings or the visit by Descanay, or the attempt by him and others to lobby the famous old League of Nations, and how there were NGO meetings in the 70s, which were extremely important in relation to the first decade to combat racism, when many indigenous peoples came to Geneva and broke through into UN territory, so to speak. But the first official, if you like, official moment was this moment in 1982, when truly it can be said, the door is there, and so on. Now, I think that, you know, in order to understand a little bit what has been achieved, you have to go back and think of a couple of things. And I'm saying, you know, when I was, even in that point when this working group was being established, the prevailing wisdom on indigenous peoples officially was that they should be assimilated. I think I'm right in saying that, because this was what the ILO Convention 107 basically says. It says some good things, perhaps. It says their lands should be protected, but essentially the thinking behind it, and the thinking behind much of, if I can say, official opinion and policy, was that indigenous peoples were peoples who were eventually going to more or less be integrated into the wider societies and modernized and so on and so forth. And this was a prevailing kind of thinking. My sense when I mean, if we try to see what has been achieved, you have to think, well, when that door was opened, and it was the first day was the 9th of August, by the way, which was the day that was finally chosen as the International Day for Indigenous Peoples. When that door was first opened, probably everybody in that room who was an expert was thinking, probably this is about getting better conditions, treating people better, but essentially in the context of indigenous peoples being better integrated into. And I think you have to go back, because 25 years later, this is an impossible thing to imagine. But that was prevailing, and you only have to go back a few years before that to see that in practice that was happening. And you, Willie, you know it intimately, because you were talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, on which you're a commissioner, which is dealing precisely with residential schools which were taking young indigenous peoples from their community in order to breed out, as they used to say in Australia, their culture, and make them, if you like everybody else, good Canadians, good Australians, and so on and so forth. And I even remember when, at this particular meeting, I was very surprised to learn from an Aboriginal person that, in fact, Aboriginal people in Australia had not got the vote until 1967. That's right, isn't it? I'm right, I think. You know, I mean, they were, technically speaking. So we're talking really about something which in the early 80s was something where the situation of indigenous peoples was very, very serious. There were policies actually in place in countries all over the world which were discriminatory. There were not very little protection of those peoples. And indigenous peoples had really very little space. Now, in a short while, I'm going to do what both Willie and Tim Coulter have done. I'm not going to try and capture everything, but just I'm going to flash through. 1982, there were about 20 people in this room. I remember around about 2000 or 1996, 97, I had to do the speakers list. I mean, we had all the speakers, and we could not cram the speakers into the working group, because there were so many indigenous peoples coming to that working group. And just for information, on one occasion we had, I think, 1,400 people, not all indigenous, not all indigenous, but at one point we had 1,400 people coming to the meetings of the Working Group on Indigenous Populations, which is now the case in the Permanent Forum. I think you're having well over 1,000, probably nearer 2,000 people sometimes coming to those meetings. So you have to say, well, from 20, it moved to, 1,000. I mean, this is a phenomenal increase. I mean, if I had put money on it, we were talking about gambling outside with Andrea, and I'd seen how it would grow, I would be a millionaire, because, if I'd had my money and said, well, 20 has moved up to 1,000, it's not a bad investment. So there was a tremendous increase, and one of the things I think is interesting is how indigenous peoples began to work out how the system worked and managed to exploit the UN in this kind of Columbus style, we're going to come and we're going to take this place over a little bit, figure out how we're going to get something out of this dreadful place. And I think you can look to a lot of achievement. The first thing I thought was quite good, apart from the declaration which has been referred to, was that a lot of indigenous people said it's great that you have a meeting place for us to come to, but who can come to Geneva, and who can afford to pay the tickets, and who can afford to stay in these hotels which were very expensive? Most of us can hardly afford to pay for a coffee and stuff like that. So they started complaining a lot, because, indigenous peoples were always complaining. That's what we felt when we were in the UN, always wanting something else. And they said, basically, we want some money. We want some money. We want the governments to give us some money so we can come to these meetings and just, criticize the governments, basically. And a fund was established in 1985, and I think that's really an amazing thing, that at that point in 1985, a fund was established, still exists today, and I think it pays for about 120 people per year to different meetings of the UN. It was a really clever idea, I thought, because, and there's nowhere else, it doesn't exist anywhere else, actually, and no other NGO had thought of it, that governments ought to pay for them to come and, make their human rights complaints in a human rights body. There was something else that I thought was extremely interesting at that time. We made reference to the ILO, and it was true that the ILO process, which is a very rapid process, as you said, Willie, which began with an expert meeting in 1986, to which a few indigenous peoples participated, but in which, quite interestingly, there was almost no opportunity to really participate. I was there also as an NGO at that time, and it was really very difficult for indigenous peoples even to find a seat, because it was like they were sort of crammed at the back. There was a little few chairs, and you maybe now and again there was a possibility right at the end of a session, if there's a few minutes, for a few indigenous peoples to take the floor. That's my recollection of it. Notwithstanding, I think that the ILO 169 is a good instrument personally, and very helpful for indigenous peoples, and it's been very helpful in Latin America. But the process, and this was rather interesting, the UN was going a different route in a way which was saying this is a process, this declaration is going to be a process in which indigenous peoples are going to be full participants. They're going to be there in the room. This isn't going to take place outside. And the indigenous peoples, maybe they'd seen the ILO and they thought this is not the way we want to go, but there was a need to have people in the room, and it seemed to me that that was really one of the most important things about the declaration, and one of the reasons why I think the declaration has a potential to be very effective is because so many indigenous peoples over the years feel that they contributed to it. I mean, even if they didn't contribute much, they're just being there. There were enough people coming to say they had a kind of right to it. They had a kind of, if you like, ownership of it. And I think that will be extremely important, because actually, internationally speaking, very few people from what we call civil society, they're not always civil, but civil society, actually take part in the process of developing these kinds of international law. It's usually diplomats and a few lawyers and a bit of Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch and stuff like that. But it's not the victims, if you like, or the beneficiaries who are present in the room. So you have a very interesting case in which the beneficiaries were actually present in the room, actually talking to everybody and try to influence the results. And I think it means that the declaration, Indigenous peoples feel this is our declaration. It's not something that's been invented by others. And actually, I tell people that there's only one article in this declaration which was proposed by governments, and that's the very last one, I think, if I'm not mistaken, which basically says, don't take our, territorial integrity from us. That is what we care about, etc., etc. But all the rest comes from indigenous peoples. It's been modified by states, but the ideas came from them, and so on. Now, I'm going to hurry because my experience moved in 1991. I was asked or I had the opportunity to take over a position in the United Nations, and it was as the secretary of the Working Group on Indigenous Populations. Well, secretary is a funny kind of word in the UN, but anyway, I was a secretary, and I was the secretary of this working group, which basically means the poor guy who gets the organization, and everybody complains about because their things are not right, and the kind of thing that goes on. And the first, if you like, one of my first jobs was to organize a seminar on, well, it was really on self-government, but actually the title of the seminar was so long and complicated, I didn't really truly understand it, and probably most people didn't. It was something like the realization of situations in which indigenous peoples, I can't remember, it certainly wasn't peoples anyway, you're right, had experiences of self-governing situation. I don't know what, something so convoluted that you wondered what it could possibly be, but it was pretty harmless. But basic was about self-determination. And it was held in Greenland, which was also very interesting. And I was very happy to be able to organize that meeting, because out of that meeting came a kind of interesting idea. And that was that these meetings really of so-called experts really should be in the hands of indigenous peoples, because what was happening is you get a lot of experts who are themselves non-indigenous. I mean, even I'm considered an expert, which is a bit absurd, but and you have a situation where indigenous people have very little space. And 1991 was quite interesting because, in fact, a couple of years earlier there had been a seminar in 1989 on racism. And it was the very, very first time that an indigenous person was invited to be what's called the rapporteur, which is like write up the report, right? It was Ted Moses, I believe, at the time. And this was kind of a breakthrough. And I thought, yeah, this is really where we should be going. And I think when we got there, there was a discussion at that meeting about, who was going to chair the meeting. And as I was in the UN, you have an authority, when it's very interesting when you say, you don't have any authority in Oklahoma, I know, but in other places the UN has an authority. And if I say, well, that's what we do in the UN, everybody says, oh, okay, well, yeah, sure. And I said, well, in the UN, we always have one of the officers, so-called officers, who is an indigenous, and the other who is a government. And I thought, and everybody said, oh, okay, right. And in this particular meeting, it was an indigenous person who was chosen to be the chair of that meeting, a Greenlander, which is logical as well. And the other nice thing is that, well, I don't know if it's a nice thing, but I thought it was an interesting thing, is that there was interpretation into Greenlandic. And I like that very much, because apart from Greenlandic language has only 3 letters, which is, I think, K, A, and Q, and everything's like this. I don't know, am I right? And they don't have... it's a language which doesn't have many words, so every new word has to have lots of things added to it. So the version of the seminar, which was already long, was extremely long and I've kept somewhere in my files the sort of folder where all the papers went in with this enormously long title with words about 30 or 40 letters in them and stuff like that. Anyway, that's Greenlandic. That's their problem, I guess. That's their language. So anyway, but the point is that indigenous people's language is extremely important. We've talked about that before. And why shouldn't the UN actually have things in indigenous language? And I tried when it was possible to do that, and we did the next ceremony, we did one on environment, and we had it in Chile. I don't know if anybody went to that meeting, but we managed to get the government to agree to get Mapudungun, which is the language of, I think I pronounced it right, the Mapuche people. And so we had interpretation, we had some of the documentation. And I think it was quite important, but to have a sense in which the meetings start to take a different kind of flavor. And it's true what I think one of you mentioned, the invocation, I think it was you. And I do remember at first the nervousness in the UN when they were saying, we're going to have a prayer, you know. I don't know if you know the Middle East, but there's all these things about these prayers, and and you think, oh my God, one's going to say one prayer and the next is going to say another prayer and so on. So you can see there's a kind of reason why the UN avoids anything that's remotely like favoring one religion rather than another religion or even a non-religion. But anyway, an invocation, and it became sort of like a habit, didn't it? As something which was accepted. And even some of, as particular North American, Canadian, you guys, were very keen on all coming together and holding hands, right? This tradition. And I must say at some point it became very amusing to see delegations, governmental delegations, being obliged by indigenous peoples to hold hands. And when you sometimes got US and Cuba holding hands, you had to admit this was very fun, and you had to sit at the podium, because I sat at the podium like I'm sitting here, well, and stood and watched, and I held hands with I used to hold hands with a Greek lady who was a lot older than me, and so on, and anyway, we became very good friends and so on. So I was always holding her hand, and just find the sort of delegations, the different mixtures of people, just because of the way things were, the seats were set up in the room. Anyway, but there was quite an important influence, I think, by indigenous peoples on the way business was done in the UN, and I think it's been quite interesting. And that was one of them, the fact that the invocation, the idea that people need to try to achieve something through harmony, this kind of try to build consensus, respect for the word of everybody, let everybody have their say and stuff like that. Many, many very important, I think, interesting developments in the UN, which delegations actually began to appreciate, I have to say. And then on the other side, of course, the way indigenous peoples had to change to the UN, like they had to write their speeches, poor things, because otherwise the interpreters won't be able to translate them right, so they had to start typing up their statements. And instead of having these wonderful poetic kind of speeches where people would really talk for a long time about where they came from, there'd be, yeah, okay, right, yes, we don't care about you people, just what's the point? What do you want to say? This kind of thing. It must have been very frustrating, but actually in the end indigenous peoples did, make their 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minute speeches. And I do remember an occasion, I don't know who it was, I don't think it was you, Mr. Littlechild. I think it might have been Ted Moses, but in any case, at some point, indigenous person had his computer and was reading his speech, and somehow or another the computer died. And I thought, and he said, I'm very apologetic to the chair, can I speak a little bit later because my computer's died on me? And I thought, wow, this is the oral traditions met its match, after all these years. So anyway, all that to say, it's the transformation, the change of practices, and more seriously, in the case of the declaration, and all credit to indigenous peoples, because, actually making governments listen is really difficult. It's really difficult. But in the UN, many of the indigenous peoples made the governments listen. And it was quite interesting, because they threatened them in ways that no other NGO or governments would dare to do. Like, well, if you won't listen to us, we're going to walk out. Well, this is quite heavy stuff, And they actually did walk out. And then the governments don't know what to do, because they're sitting in the room, and the people they're meant to be, discussing are all absent outside, So it did make a great impact, I think, on governments, those kinds of actions to say, this isn't about you, it's about us, and we want to be involved. And I think that was a really, some of the stories, I mean, of course, the hunger strike, but I didn't like to say to Andrea during the hunger strike that actually not allowed to bring food into the room or any drink. So but I thought that would be a very unfair thing to say to her at that time. But these actions have a very important political result. I mean, really, of course, they sound very silly, but negotiating in this kind of environment where, you know, the governments really run the show, you know, how do you stop them running the show? You know, how do you begin to take a little bit from them and say, you're not the only ones running the show? And you have to, I think, you have to do the kinds of things that many of you did. I'm not going to be too long because I just want to say something. I mean, I could go along because I'm a bit of a storyteller. Apologies about that. But yeah, no, but well, you're all storytellers, aren't you? So it's. But okay, there was a point, just a kind of historical point, and I think it's kind of interesting. Is that I always try to understand like a sequence, because I sometimes ask you, tell a little bit, you know, the story of the indigenous peoples. I do that with this Tulsa course, you know, and one or two people have suffered from that in the room here today. So, and I always try and think, well, how do you kind of present it historically? And I kind of think that there was a kind of period of 10 years, which was like where indigenous peoples were like Christopher Columbus, you know, kind of on this discovery, which was from about 1982 to 1992. I mean, grosso modo, as they say in Latin, you know, more or less. And why? Because, you know, there were not many people able to come in the first 10 years. It was expensive. They were figuring out how it works and stuff like that, and so on. But somehow or another, there was a moment, and I think 1992 is a kind of interesting moment, when everything started to come together and there was a sudden explosion. And I think there were a number of things, and I just want to point them out. In 1992, there was a very big conference called the Earth Summit on environment and development. It took place in Rio de Janeiro. I think if it had taken place in a cold and miserable town, it might not have been so successful, but because it's in Rio de Janeiro, the world's press, you know, just said, we've got to go, you know. Of course you've got to go, you know. We've got to go to Rio de Janeiro, you know, of course, why not? So you had this fantastic number of the press who suddenly became very excited about environment. And actually, there's nothing to be excited about a world conference. I can tell you I was involved in 3 world conferences, and the boringest part of the world conference is the plenary, to be honest. And some of you have seen the plenary, because in a plenary meeting, there's no negotiation, because all the negotiation is going on elsewhere. In the plenary meeting, you have the minister of some place or another who's come and he's reading out a very boring speech, and the only people in the room who are listening are his own delegation. Everybody else is out, you know, doing some negotiating. So plenary isn't great, is it? I mean, really. But anyway, I don't know why we're talking about the plenary. I've quite forgotten. But there was probably a reason, wasn't there? Yeah, you probably remember it. But the plenary. But anyway, I suppose no, there was a reason for the plenary, and that was actually it was the first time in the World Conference an indigenous people spoke in a plenary, and a Brazilian indigenous people was given the floor in the plenary. It's symbolic, but it's suddenly, you know, you have to think, well, hang on. In 1982, that would not have been imaginable. And suddenly in 1992, you have indigenous peoples who have begun to learn, I think, how to work together, build consensus, and suddenly setting up their own conference in Rio de Janeiro too, the Carioca Conference, where lots and lots of indigenous were talking about environment, preparing their own, if you like, counter papers and producing their own proposals and stuff like that. And I think that was actually a kind of, for me, that was a kind of moment or a kind of point in the story when indigenous peoples had kind of learnt the system and sort of think, now let's put it into practice. Now let's try to really influence a big event. We'll have our own event there. And the press took a lot of interest in it because, frankly, the plenary was very boring, and if they couldn't get to the beach, or I know they were told you can't stay on the beach all day, you've got to do something, they went off to these Carioca meetings, and they took a lot of interest in what indigenous people's perspective was, and actually that conference led to a report, and it's the first time in that report that there's a chapter fully devoted to indigenous people. So for me, that kind of date is a kind of interesting point when things seem to turn. That was the date when Rigoberta Menchú won the Nobel Prize. A year later, there was something called the International Year of the World's Indigenous Peoples. It preceded a decade. It was indigenous peoples had campaigned a lot for that. They wanted it in 1992, actually. But there were one or two governments who were not so happy about having 1992, 500 years after the wonderful and glorious discovery by Columbus, being celebrated by indigenous people. So they said, no, you can have 1993 afterwards, and that's what happened. But it was important, and it was important not so much perhaps for the indigenous peoples of the Americas, but because for the first time indigenous peoples in other regions began to hear about the UN. And we had in 1993 for the very first time indigenous peoples from Africa. We began to have people from countries in Asia who'd never attended, like Nepal. We began to have indigenous peoples from Russia. It was Russia at that point, Russia Federation. I think it was Russian Federation, yeah. Coming to the meeting too. So we began to explode with these new groups of people who said, but this is our story too. So I think 1993, and then we had a World Conference on Human Rights, and a very important World Conference, because one of the recommendations was the creation of a permanent forum on indigenous issues, apart from a lot of other recommendations. So for me, that's kind of an important issue, and then it seemed to just accelerate, if I can say it like that. Accelerated because suddenly I think indigenous people saw the UN is not just human rights. There's a lot of other things there they need to impact. The World Health, the UN Development Programme, WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization. Hang on a minute, what's this? How are we going to protect our traditional knowledge? How are we going to use this? How are we going to force our way into WIPO? And just as a kind of anecdotal story, I remember, and I don't know who was with me, but a number of indigenous people said, we'd like to visit WIPO. And I said, I'll go with you. You know, I'll phone up somebody I know there and we'll go and visit. And there were about 8 or 9 people. And I promise you, we went into that building and everybody opened the offices to look. It was so bizarre for them to see non-WIPO staff walking down a corridor to have a meeting at that time with the deputy head, I think, or director of the organization. And so on. It's to say that a lot has changed, I guess. And I think if we stand now, you know, I think we're 2010. Yeah, we're 2010. But in 2010, we say, where are we now? And we see a permanent forum in which there are 16 members, the majority of whom are indigenous persons, indigenous experts. You have an expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples. 4 of the 5 are indigenous persons. I use the word persons, not peoples. Careful, individuals, experts and stuff, because they're representing, not representing, they're meant to be in their individual capacity participating in these meetings. We have a special rapporteur, as you all know, James Anaya, an indigenous person. We actually have our famous voluntary fund on indigenous populations, which I mentioned earlier, which also is got 5 indigenous persons, people, well, and yeah, in that voluntary fund. I think they call it Board of Trustees. Yeah? So you can see when I talk about Columbus and invasion of Columbus, you know, you can see there's a little bit of a comparison how indigenous peoples have looked at the UN and said, we want a bit of this action. And I think if we look at 2010, and in some ways, you know, I have to say, since it's kind of I stopped working this July, and I think, well, what has been achieved by indigenous peoples, what have I seen has been achieved by indigenous peoples, coincided a little bit with my professional life. And I see, well, we've got this amazing declaration, yeah, and it has recognition of land rights, and it recognizes prior and informed consent. It has self-determination recognized. You've got 3 mechanisms in the UN which are extremely effective with indigenous peoples, running them, taking decisions in them, and so on and so forth. And I sort of reel back to 1982, and I think, well, you know, this has to be reviewed. This has to be seen as an amazing achievement by indigenous peoples, and actually by governments, because, you know, you managed to persuade them to take these actions. So in some ways, you know, when I think how useless the UN is, because I think it's rather useless in many ways, and I don't mean to be, you know, a kind of Tea Party position here. I mean that it wastes a lot of money. I think it doesn't achieve a lot of its objectives. It's very bureaucratic and so on. I'm not going to go into the negative sides. But when I look at what has been achieved for the indigenous peoples, I think it's quite amazing. And I have to say, you know, to colleagues that are here, the indigenous friends that are here, you know, you have done an amazing thing. I mean, you have really done an amazing thing, because to take this institution, which is so difficult and heavyweight, and it's like a tanker, you know, one of those old tankers that you can hardly move, you know, because it takes so much to move, and have made them, you know, accept, do you have these mechanisms? The permanent forum you forgot to mention is at a very high level of the UN. You know, those of you who like these kind of organigrammy things, you know, it's at a very high level. It's just 2 steps from the General Assembly. It's not bad. It's not bad. You know, and actually a lot of other civil society groups are quite jealous in some way of the achievements of indigenous peoples. So it's an achievement. Now I want to finish, I should have finished a bit before, but I want to finish with just one thing, because I really wanted to say, is this really a success, or is it just a gigantic kind of public relations thing going on? I mean, is it really successful? And there is, I think, if we look institutionally at a body like the UN, we have to say yes. I mean, there's no way you cannot deny that this has been a phenomenal advance for indigenous peoples institutionally. But I have to say that I go and I visit communities in different parts of the world, and there's still a lot of real problems, and actually problems that haven't got better in those 20 years. And this is the truth. And, you know, yesterday I was invited to give a talk in this same room to some classes here, and I tried to say that, you know, in some parts of the world, you know, the indigenous people's incomes haven't increased, their health hasn't necessarily increased, and so on. So there's still an enormous, we've got success at the UN, but the success is still to be achieved nationally, at home, and so on. And I think that, you know, one danger is to say, well, you know, you've got your stuff in the UN, you don't complain anymore, you know. But I think you have to say, we've got the stuff in the UN because we needed that stuff, we need that declaration, we need our spaces, we need to be engaged in the discussions on climate change and development goals and all these things. But there's still the big story, which in the big story to me is what happens on the ground in the communities. And I think there we have to have a declaration. You've got the declaration, and it comes back to, can we get it implemented? Can we get it actually used? Can we get it part of the living, you know, life in the community? And I think for me, you know, as I look forward to the new generation, you know, if I can say that, generation, if you can look, you know, it's that, how can we take these achievements and now like make them work at home? You know, take this declaration and apply it to us in our community. Take these achievements of the indigenous peoples internationally, because it was necessary to do that internationally. You couldn't have achieved the things without that. You know, how can we take that and transform things, engage governments, force them to discuss with, take the same tactics in way and say, talk to us. We want to know how we can implement this declaration, how we can ensure the improvement of conditions of indigenous peoples, access to education, improving health, the tuberculosis figures, the shocking figures that you gave, Willie, and so on and so forth. And I think for me that is really, you know, there is a success story, but unfortunately we have to recognize, and you know, that there are still so many things to do. So basically, I suppose, to those younger people who are going to go out there and hopefully do work internationally and nationally, you know, there's still an awful lot to do. You know, these guys haven't done it. You know, they did a lot, but there's still lots to do. So basically, you know, I wanted to end with this kind of slightly realistic note, not negative note, with a positive note, but saying I think my sense is that, you know, there's lots to do for the younger generation. Okay, thank you very much.